Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And here we are, another edition of the Talking Books and Stuffs podcast. Today we have with us Thomas F Pedersen, Professor Emeritus, and we're talking about the carbon tax question. So, sir, first of all, again, thank you for hooking up with us at this time, even though we might have got the times mixed up.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So, before we actually begin, can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know, of course, you're a Professor Emeritus from the University of Victoria, but what led up to that?
Well, it's a long story. I grew up on a farm in the South Okanagan, in the Okanagan Valley, and decided after undergraduate education in geology that I was still curious about the world. And after working as an exploration geologist for a couple of years, I went back to graduate school to study oceanography and became a marine geochemist. And but I started to work on the chemistry of sediments on the seafloor and to do research on those when I came back to UBC as a young professor. And one of the things that soon became evident was that the ocean had undergone a lot of changes over the last 100,000 years or so, and they were related to switches in climate, and of course largely to do with the variability between ice ages and non-ice ages. So I developed an interest in climate change, and over the years I ended up moving to the University of Victoria, and eventually I became the director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions here at the University of Victoria, which was a new body set up by Gordon Campbell, Premier Gordon Campbell, in 2008. And at that time, carbon taxation was just picking up steam here in British Columbia, thanks to the initiatives of the Gordon Campbell government. So I developed quite a strong interest in tracking how carbon taxes can be used to blunt the leading edge of the global warming challenge that we all face now.
And so what exactly, you can explain it to us like I'm a 4-year-old, what is a carbon tax? Because out here where we live in the middle of the prairies, it's a terrible thing to impose upon the poor working person.
Well, I'll define it first, and then I'll point out that it's not a terrible thing at all.
Right.
In fact, it can be your friend, and I'll explain why here in a minute. What a carbon tax is it is a tax, it's a tariff on something that we don't want, which is carbon emissions. And the rationale is really simple there. Carbon emissions as resulting from human activities like burning fossil fuels or leaking methane into the atmosphere cause the planet to warm up. And this is something that's been known since 1861. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. And we see it all around us these days. And you certainly see it in Saskatchewan with extreme weather events, with prolonged droughts, with prolonged cold snaps, which ironically are also related to global warming. I could explain why later on. And so the result is that we are putting the planet, as far as human society's future goes, in a rather precarious position, because we're surrounded now by extreme weather events that did not happen when I was a youngster. They are happening now with increasing frequency. They're extremely damaging. I'll just point out that in this year alone, in 2024 alone, in the first 11 months of this year, Canada has experienced extreme weather events, primarily floods, but also wildfires, that have caused something in excess of $9 billion in insured insurance claims. And the consequence of that is you in Saskatoon are paying more for your house insurance. In my case here in Victoria, I paid double what I paid about 8 years ago for house insurance, and that's because of the cost that the insurance companies are forced to bear from increasing claims due to things like floods, deluges, wildfires, and so on. So The carbon tax is a tool that we have available to encourage people to burn less fossil fuel. Now, why it can be your friend is if it's well defined,
Right.
which it was here in British Columbia in our 2008 to 2013 period. It's a revenue neutral carbon tax where the money that you pay as a tax on burning fossil fuel comes right back to you. So it's taken out of your right pocket to buy gasoline, for example, or propane or natural gas for heating, and it comes right back to you in your left pocket. And if you burn less natural gas, let's say you put in a heat pump, or let's say you trade in your Ford F-150 V8 for a hybrid pickup truck, you still get the money back, but you're burning less carbon, so you're paying less tax. So you actually have more cash in your pocket, and that's how it can be your friend. And that's what we did here in British Columbia. We guaranteed revenue neutrality in 2008. We brought in a carbon tax. It was accelerating gently year by year at a rate of $5 per ton of carbon emitted per year, or carbon dioxide emitted per year, I should say. And it was reimbursed to us indirectly by lowered income tax, lowered corporate income tax, lowered small business tax. And if you qualified for the GST refund checks, in other words, if you were a low-income British Columbian, you got direct cash back. And so everyone in this province paid the carbon tax, but they also got reimbursed for the carbon tax, either indirectly through other tax reductions in terms of income, corporate or small business tax, or direct cash subventions, direct cash payments if you're a low income.
So does that explain why so many people are opposed to it in principle? You know, Pierre Poilievre and other people with the axe the tax chant. Is that because it hasn't been properly explained to them, do you think?
Yes, you've just nailed it. If you look at how the carbon tax has been communicated here in British Columbia, going back now to 2008, Gordon Campbell was very astute, very smart to bring in the world's best designed carbon tax. And it is the world's, or at least was the world's best designed carbon tax. But what the government failed to do, what they actually forgot to do, I think, was to remind people over and over and over again that they were getting the money back. You know, for the first year, 2008, 2009, most of us remembered that our income tax had gone down. But by about 2012, most of us had forgotten that our income tax had gone down. Here we are now in 2024, and the lowered income tax rates that were established on January 1st of 2008 and 2009, funded by the carbon tax, are still in place in British Columbia. But if you ask an average British Columbian if they know that their income tax is being kept low by carbon tax revenue, they'll say, no, I didn't know that. And in fact, here in BC, we enjoy the lowest personal income tax in Canada. It's quite a bit lower than what you pay in Saskatchewan. And in part, that's funded by the carbon tax.
And that seems to be the crux of the matter, because on an individual level, people are saying, well, I don't, such as myself, I kept wondering how taxing me was going to, I'll say tax me, was going to stop me from driving more. So does it work that way on an individual level, or is it more of an overall solution for the population in general?
No, it does work that way on an individual level and on a corporate level as well. Now, I need to shift here to the Canadian scene, away from British Columbia for a moment.
Yep.
You know, in 2018, the Justin Trudeau government brought in the Carbon Pricing Act for Canada. And what that did was, it was actually based loosely on the British Columbia model. But it differed a little bit in that because Canada is a patchwork of provinces in Confederation that all have different ways of producing energy, different ways of consuming carbon, different ways of producing carbon dioxide. There needed to be a flexible national system, and that's what Trudeau brought in. It has two pieces to it. One is the consumer fuel charge, which is what you and I on an individual basis would recognize as the carbon tax. So if we buy propane or natural gas or gasoline or diesel, we're paying the consumer fuel charge. If you're a corporation and emit large amounts of carbon dioxide, let's say in the oil sands, for example, like Suncor, then you have a different system. You pay tax on every ton of carbon dioxide you emit through what's called the output-based pricing system. And that money received, that revenue that's received by the federal government, is returned to the province from which the tax was paid. So in the case of the oil sands in Fort McMurray, Alberta gets the money back. And they decide how to redistribute that carbon tax revenue that has been received from the federal government. So they may give it back to Suncor and say, use this money to improve your technology and reduce emissions.
So what we have on the one hand is Alberta benefiting from the carbon tax, and on the other hand, publicly saying, axe the tax, which seems self-defeating at best.
Well, it is self-defeating, and it's rather cheap politics, frankly. You have to keep in mind that Alberta doesn't benefit directly. It's revenue neutral, or largely revenue neutral. And so the money that comes back to Alberta, they can use that to apply to technological innovation, for example, that will reduce emissions. Alberta benefits indirectly from lower emissions because, first of all, people will be more accepting of their product, which is heavy oil, essentially, from the oil sands. But of course, they'll benefit indirectly as well by a better environment over time if we lower carbon emissions. And then when we look at individuals, the average Albertan family of 4 people gets back about $2,240 per year in direct cash support from Ottawa, thanks to the Trudeau carbon tax, because it's a revenue neutral carbon tax. That same family likely spends less than $2,240 a year on the actual carbon tax. They probably have excess money in their pocket. Okay. They will not have excess money in their pocket if they live in a 6,000 square foot house heated by natural gas and have 3 cars in the driveway and a Hummer in the garage. Then they're going to be paying more carbon tax than they will get back in cash support. Right. And that's fair enough. That's the way it should be.
So how has a carbon tax over the years, has it actually helped lower emissions somewhat? Yes, it certainly helped very much in British Columbia, and the data on this are very clear. Between 2008 and 2013, when our carbon tax was functioning as designed by the Gordon Campbell government, our emissions fell 19% in British Columbia on a per capita basis relative to the rest of Canada. And during that time, our economy grew at least as fast as the rest of Canada, and our clean technology sector took off. It just literally exploded in terms of growth. We had enormous employment generated in the clean tech sector, thanks to the carbon tax, which dramatically increased investment in clean technology here in British Columbia, and particularly on the innovation side. So we had something like 215 new companies sprang up in the first 2 or 3 years of the carbon tax here in BC. And most of the experts in the field will tell you that the biggest single factor in stimulating that investment in clean technology in BC was that the province was being seen internationally as a beacon of light for the future in terms of clean technology development. Companies wanted to be established here because they felt that the government was firmly on the side of innovation,
And they saw corporate tax go down and small business income tax go down. And they saw personal income tax go down, which would benefit their employees, their workforce. So everyone was winning from that. And it's because the design was so good, because the system was fully revenue neutral. And that revenue neutrality was in fact required by law. Part of the act that Campbell passed, it took effect on July 1st of 2008, demanded full revenue neutrality by the Treasury Ministry.
We're talking with Professor Thomas F. Pedersen. The book in question is The Carbon Tax Question, complex yet interesting subject that he delineates quite well. And it's about the BC carbon tax, but how do you get that message across to the rest of the world is my big question.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, there are a number of ways you can get it across. First of all, I wrote a book on the topic to try and at least raise the level of conversation about the subject. And I wanted to raise that level of conversation because the word carbon tax, or the phrase carbon tax, has been stolen by malfeasant actors who are manipulating it for purely political purposes, without any concern whatsoever about the global warming challenge that we all face as human beings. And, primarily, one of the primary individuals in the front of that, of course, is our leader of the opposition, Mr. Poilievre, who seized on the word tax. And he focuses entirely on the word tax, usually calls it the job-killing carbon tax when he's describing it, or the tax that's driving up the price of everything. And in fact, what he fails to mention, in fact, I don't think I have ever heard him use the word rebate or refund or the phrase revenue neutral. I'm not sure if he's even aware of those words, but he certainly does not use them.
Right.
And so what he's doing is very effectively seizing on the aversion to the word tax that all of us share. I don't like the word tax more than anybody else. But when it's a revenue neutral tax, and when I know, and I emphasize the word know, when I know I'm getting the money back, and when I know that tax, that revenue neutral tax, is going toward reducing carbon emissions that are harming us, then I'm quite happy to pay it. But where we've fallen down as a nation, both provincially and federally, is that we don't communicate that the tax is in fact revenue neutral and that you get the money back. And that is a big problem for Canada. We must radically, dramatically increase the level of communication about the importance of revenue neutrality, because the best designed carbon taxes in the world are the type that British Columbia established in 2008. And you don't have to take my word for that. You can take the word of the Fraser Institute and the right-wing economists there, who fully agree that 100% revenue neutral carbon tax is the best tool in the toolbox to use to combat global warming. Or you can listen to Preston Manning, who is firmly in favor of revenue neutral carbon taxation.
Right. And he's the one who started the Reform Party back in the 90s out of nothing, pretty much. So a good person to listen to. So what do you say, again, on the bigger question, people like our feared leader to the south who says it's all a big hoax and that kind of stuff. How do you convince people that what they're thinking is absolutely wrong? Or can we?
Oh, you've just opened a big can of worms there. That's a brilliant question. It's a brilliant question. One of the big challenges, I think, that we face as a human species now, and this applies to many countries around the world, is the responsibility of the media to tell the truth. And what we are seeing in the United States is something like 54% of Americans get their primary news from Fox News. Now that's an old statistic. It's probably more common now to say I get my news from Facebook or some other social media source or X.
Yep.
And what's happening is that if you listen to Fox News, they frankly don't tell the truth when it comes to global warming. There's a lot of global warming denial still being broadcast by Fox News. And it's nothing but mistruths, misinformation, outright lies, and the like. We don't have so much of that in Canada, but what we do have here is a media which is a little bit sloppy in how it discusses the carbon taxation issue. If you look at the mainstream media across the country, how often do you see the carbon tax being actually presented in 4 words rather than 2? Right. And those 4 words should be, and always should be, revenue neutral carbon tax.
Revenue neutral, yes.
But it's not presented that way.
Right.
Instead, what we hear is carbon tax, and then you get Scott Moe or Daniel Smith or many others, sometimes Doug Ford, certainly Pierre Poilievre, saying job-killing carbon tax. Well, he could not say job-killing revenue-neutral carbon tax because that wouldn't be true.
That wouldn't work. Gotcha. And that
wouldn't work.
And the thing is, of course, as soon as all of us hear the word tax or axe the tax, the first reaction, a visceral reaction kind of is, oh yeah, that's what I'm in favor of, because it's the thing that triggers you right away, like you say, is, oh yeah, I hate taxes, without even examining the situation, which I guess is a sort of a problem with humanity in general.
Well, it is. I mean, you can understand that someone who's hasn't been reminded that the tax is revenue neutral, and doesn't really understand the power of that. If someone comes up to them and says, you know, you're paying 17 cents a liter on gasoline in Saskatoon on the federal carbon tax, the consumer fuel charge, 17 cents a liter. What if we just axe that and you pay 17 cents a liter less on your pickup truck? And so if you're putting in 100 liters of gas, that's going to save you $17. What do you think about that? Everyone will say, that's great.
Yep.
Geez, I'd like to save $17. But then, if you say, but wait a minute, the federal government is paying me a couple of $1,000s a year to me and my family as a rebate for that carbon tax. What's going to happen to that? Are they still going to be paying me a couple of $1,000s a year to my family? Or is that going to disappear? Because if that disappears, I'm actually going to be out of pocket. You're going to cost me money by axing the tax. You're not going to make me money. Then I won't be in favor of it. So tell me the truth. Right. Where's that $2,000 a year or so going to come from if you axe the tax? Now, that's a question that Pierre Poilievre has never answered, nor has Daniel Smith, nor has Scott Moe.
Exactly, right. Well, actually, we are just outside of Saskatoon, and we do have a Ford F-150 pickup in the driveway. But, yeah, it's got the EcoBoost engine, so it does save us fuel. But we don't...
Yep, but do you know, I can ask you straight out, do you know you're getting the money back?
Yes. We get the rebate, and we only have a family of 2, but we get the I'll call them rebate checks, even though it's a direct deposit, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
And when it comes as a direct deposit, how is it labeled on your bank statement?
Good question. I'll have to look that up. So I can't.
I'll tell you what happens here in BC. My son is a computer science student, and so he's low income, so he qualifies for the GST refund checks. So 4 times a year he gets a check from the government.
Yep.
And the British Columbia carbon tax rebate portion of the British Columbia carbon tax appears on his bank statement as Canada FTP. Canada FTP. What the heck does that mean?
Ah.
Well, it turns out I took it into a bank to ask them, what does it mean? And it's FTP stands for Federal, Territorial, Provincial.
Oh.
And on the checks that are issued here in British Columbia, or at least the direct deposits in BC alone, that is the label that the banks have chosen to use. It says nothing about carbon tax rebate.
Right. Okay.
That's a communication failure by the authorities. And it's a really sad indictment. It tells us how poorly we've been communicating the issue of giving the money back to Canadians.
Gotcha. Well, having said all that, is there any hope for the world, or are we doomed anyway?
There's always hope. We must never give up hope. I think Barack Obama campaigned on that, in fact,
Yep.
Years ago. No, we must never give up hope. What we do need to be really careful of, I think, is that we need to be asking the right questions of our politicians, and we need to be holding them to account. And we cannot let someone like Ms. Smith or Scott Moe duck the issues. They can't continue to duck the rebate issue, the fact that it is coming back to Canadians through the revenue neutrality position of the carbon tax. And I think the media has a responsibility to ask the hard questions and demand correct answers or clean answers. And at the same time, the federal government and the provincial governments need to be honest with their population and robust, and particularly in Ottawa now, they need to be robust in explaining that the tax, for most of us, is revenue neutral. And it's really important to get that message across, because when you explain revenue neutrality clearly to people and recognize that what we're doing is taxing pollution to benefit the environment while giving you the money back, then people are willing to make the payment. If you don't make that clear to them, all they see is the word tax, and we all recoil from the word tax.
Exactly. And that's the carbon tax question. Thomas F. Pedersen from Harbor Publishing. I've got to thank you very much for enlightening me on this question today, sir, and continued good luck and lots of good works for you to come in the future, I'm sure. Thank you.
Well, many thanks for getting in touch.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.